All right. Well, I think most people are in here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Well, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session that is on editing, finding, and changing estimate rows. We'll be going over the different functionalities using replace, the new find and change dialog box, and then just the easy grid editing, and just to show you what's changed and how we've changed a few things around in 7.0 versus what we used to do. Overall, replace, for the most part, is very similar. There's a couple things different about it. If you've used the find and change dialog box, it's quite a bit different than how we used to use find and then change selected as it used to be on the edit menu. And then grid editing. Starting off with the easy one, grid editing. If you have something in the grid that you want to edit, let me dive down, be it a simple product, you can still use the grid just the same as you used to use. Obviously, the biggest difference is all that you see in the grid depends on the context of what you have selected in the tree. But as far as any of the custom columns, you can still change them just the same as you used to in the old world. So if you want to make a change to, in my case, width here for molding, you certainly can, just the same as you used to. The only advantage you have is that in 7.0, you can also right-click a row and choose Edit Row, and it brings up our dialog box. The advantage you have here, especially from an estimating standpoint, is that as you can see here, you can use our new functionality for the custom column aliases to show or hide specific columns or change the name of a column based on the assembly category. So that in here, in this case, since it's molding, the only 3 columns I can even change are width, labor adjustment, and thickness. So that's the advantage you have using our new dialog box, is that you're just focusing on the columns. And just as a review, if you weren't in the very first Lunch and Learn session that had to do with the new estimate sheet functionalities, if you go to your Define menu and you go down to Assembly Column Alias Names, it's by assembly category, but this is where you can decide which columns you want to show per category, as well as if you want to change the name of a specific column, you certainly can. Any of the changes you make in here only affect that Edit Row dialog box, or it's also the same dialog box you see when you first drag and drop an assembly. Any changes you make there only affect this. On the estimate sheet itself, if you're using columns, if you're showing them, that has no effect on the names of these columns or whether they're shown or not shown. If you want to hide columns, that's still done through estimate settings, hide display columns if you want to do it per this estimate, or you go to the option menu and go to the same option to do it globally. So as far as grid editing, like I say, it's very similar to the way it used to be. Okay, onwards to the stuff that changed, I guess you could say considerably. If we go to the replace functionality, so I'm going to go ahead and pick an assembly here and dive down so I get to some material and labor rows. And the replace functionality is obviously used by people that don't use job spec yet. Or even if you're using job spec, there are still some things that are easier to use the replace function. So if, for instance, I had a reason, let's say I wanted to replace this pole here, this pole 4-inch wire satin chrome pole. It's still the same as before. You double-click the item, and it brings up the same dialog box that you're used to. You click Replace, and so far it's exactly the same. You go into your library, you find the item you want to replace it with, you select it, and you click OK. Here's where it becomes different. Now there's an extra little dialog box that comes up, and now it wants you to select the scope of the tree where you want it to replace that item. So in other words, now I go over to the tree and decide which part of my job do I want to swap out that pole for. Is it just for this product? Or is it for the entire storage room? Or maybe it's for a higher node or the job as a whole. if that's the case, let's say for our purposes here, maybe it's just the 21st floor where I want to make that change. So now I'm going to select this as my scope. I'm going to click Continue, and now it's the same from here on out. So now I have, for the most part, you can say all occurrences, or we give you a few more options in here as to how maybe within the scope of the 21st floor, if you select product, it's going to list all the unique products that you have, so you can pick and choose which products. Or if you select any other the custom columns or a work group, you can be specific within the scope you selected on how you want to change that. So now it's up to your choice. I'm going to make it easy and just say all occurrences. I'm going to click OK. And now it's going to tell me, just like before, 52 line items were updated. But the beauty is, since I only selected, I'm going to collapse this, I only selected the 21st floor as my scope. So if I were to go to the 22nd floor, and if I found a cabinet that would typically have a pull on it and I dug down to it, let me get to the door. As you can see here, it didn't change the pull. So as far as replace goes, we just give you a little more flexibility that you can be a lot more specific than what you used to be able to do. So just to kind of review and go through it again, if we wanted to replace this pull, I just double click it as before, choose replace, find the item I want to replace it with, and I'll just pick the same item for consistency. And now, like it says, please indicate the scope of the change by selecting one or more tree nodes. So in this case, let's say maybe I want to select the 22nd floor and I want to select the 23rd floor. So I hold my control key down and select both. Click Continue, and now I choose how I want to update the like items, whether it's by all occurrences, product, or any one of the custom columns, or for that matter, even a work group. If I wanted to use a work group, maybe I chose product and then chose one of my work groups. I could certainly do that. Once again, I'll just pick all occurrences to make it simple. And so now it makes the change for only the scope that I selected, and when I'm done, it remembers where I was at on the grid. All right. So a few changes to replace, give you a lot more flexibility to choose the scope, and then more than just 4 choices to choose on how you want to update the like items. So for the most part, that's the replace functionality, how it's changed in 7.0. Now for the function that's changed the most. It used to be in 6.0 and before, you'd typically go to the Edit menu, and then you'd go down to Find, and then a little dialog box would come up, and you had a few different ways to use Find. Then once you had your selection, when you were done, you went back to the Edit menu, and there used to be an option that said Change Selected, and then it had a little breakout over here, and then you had a bunch of different ways you could change what you had selected. Now we've kind of put all of that into one simple dialog box, but it works a little bit differently than it did in the past. So to get to Find, you can either just go straight to the Edit menu, or you can right-click the tree, come down to Find, and now it brings up our Find Change dialog box. And it's separated into 2 tabs. The first tab is the Find tab. Similar to the Replace function, the first part talks about scope. And it will always default to, depending if you did it from the tree, whatever you right-clicked on, that's what it's going to default to. So I happen to right-click on the base bid, so that's what the context of what I had selected is. So it selects base bid. But anywhere within here, if I wanted the scope to be the entire estimate, I can change it. Same as the replaced, I could have used my control key and selected multiple nodes if I wanted to, and then right-clicked and went to Find, and then it would say Current Context. So similar to the Replace functionality, it's only going to be looking to find something within the context that you've selected. So like I said, I'm just going to keep it as estimate. The next part is asking how you want to find something. So let's say in an example today, maybe I want to find some hardware. So if I click the drop down of where, as you can see, it's a lot of the same things that you used to see on the change selected, or I think there used to be an item select, so you could mass select stuff off the edit menu. This drop down is very similar. So you have ignored, no print, there's line type, and then you have your new cost type, all of your taxes and custom columns. Then you have your work groups if you use them, and even vendor, GL account, and then part. So first you select what you want to look for. So I'm going to use line type. This next thing it says is, by default it's is, but if you click it, it'll change to is not. And if you put your mouse over it, it'll tell you equal or not equal to. So it depends on how you want to search for something. I'm going to leave it as is just to make it a little bit simpler today. And then I'm going to change it to hardware. So inside my estimate, I want it to look for all the line types, all the rows that have the line type hardware. Lastly, over here with the little button that says binoculars, there's a little arrow, a down arrow to the right of it. If I click it, by default, it's always going to be a new search. There's a couple other choices that I'll explain what they do in a minute. There's merge results and narrow results. But in this case, it's just a new search. And if I click it, it's now going to list down here every single occurrence of a line type that is of the type hardware. So it's just going to individually list every occurrence in the estimate. And if you look down at the bottom, there's a lot of status. It'll give you an idea. So it found 1,477 items are found. And if I were to scroll down this list, there'd be 1,477 rows. And the reason we allow you to do each and every one is that if I pull this down a little bit, and I'm going to shrink it for a second, if I click on an item, you'll notice it jumps to it in the grid in the background. So for this particular Accuride 3832, the 12-inch, it's going to jump to it. If I were to scroll down this list to something near the bottom, I'll pick a shelf clip, it's going to jump all the way down in the tree to that place on the grid where it's at, so that you can see each individual row and jump to it quite easily. There's also an option here that says Group Results. If you click it, what it's going to do, instead of listing every single occurrence of an item, such as this pull 96 millimeter satin nickel bar, you can see it here, and then I can click it again, and it takes me to the next occurrence. If you select Group Results, what it does is, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, it's going to limit your search, and you can obviously see I don't have that many items because now it's every unique item. In this case, it is of the line type hardware. But as you click on each one, for instance, if we go down to our pull 96 millimeter that we just replaced, you'll notice to the right of where it says Group Results, it says 1 of 114. So it still has all 114, but when I clicked on it, it took me into my estimate where the first occurrence is. If I want to go to the next occurrence, if I had a reason to, you simply click this arrow, and now it's going to start taking you to each occurrence as it exists in your estimate, so that you can easily navigate to each occurrence in your estimate as I click each one, so you can see where they're at. So it makes it a little bit easier, so you don't have almost 1,500 rows listed in here. You can group them together, and then individually for each item you can go through each occurrence of it if you need to. All right. Lastly, the item, in essence, like I said, we searched for the line type of hardware. We told it to group. And so now, let's say I'm looking for a specific item. Because if you didn't notice, this estimate's like a $2 million estimate, so it's a very large estimate. And let's say the reason why we came in to find change was that maybe we ran a line type analysis report, and we saw that there was, I think there's like 1,300 and some pairs of 20-inch Accuride slides. And so maybe we started calling around to our vendors that we typically get them from, and since we have such a high number of it, we can get bulk pricing, which would be different than what our library pricing is. So we want to go through there, find them all, and then be able to, 1, change the vendor if we need to, and then 2, maybe change the adjusted unit cost. If you're not familiar with adjusted unit cost, what it allows you to do is it's a simple way to override a library price. without actually changing it. So in other words, obviously if you went into your library and you changed the library pricing to your bulk pricing, that's what's going to be used for every estimate that you quote with. And that's not necessarily what you want to do. So adjusted unit cost, whether you do it on a single line or multiple lines, it's a simple way to override that library cost for a specific estimate. So using that example, I'm simply down here in my grid. I'm going to select the Accuride 3832 20-inch slide. And I'm going to come up here to the button and say Select. Once I do that, if you look at the bottom here, it now says 78 items are selected. If you look in the grid in the background, if I pull this down, nothing's selected like what it used to do in 6.1. And that's simply because there'd be a lot of lines selected and there's no need to actually highlight them. But if you look down here, it's saying I've got 78 items selected. Now that I have them selected, if I go to the Change tab, now I can decide how I want to change those. And if you look on the grid here, what I've selected is just those 20-inch. And if I were to scroll down, you'd see all 78 lines of them. This tab is a little bit simpler. You just have one drop down because now you're deciding how do you want to change this item. Well, let's say for our purposes today, the first thing we want to do is we want to change the vendor. Because maybe our default vendor, their pricing wasn't as good as an alternate vendor that we had. So I'm going to click this little plus button. It's going to open the typical way we find a vendor with our dialog box. And I'm going to go through here, and I'm going to do it by subcategory. I'm going to select vendor, and then I'm going to select hardware. Click search, and let's say we're going to get them from Hayfla. So now I'm going to click it, and so now it's Hayfla. And all I have to do now is say change all. And it's going to go through my estimate and change all 78 to have the vendor of Hayfla. On top of that, we changed the vendor, but now also, just as I said before, I want to go through here and change the adjusted unit cost. Because maybe I talked to Hayfla, and let's say for our purposes they used to be $10 a pair. But now since we're buying them in bulk, maybe I can get them for $8.25 a pair. So simply type in what I want the new adjusted unit cost to be, and I say change all. And as you can see in the background, it's recalculating my estimate because I just changed the adjusted unit cost of all 78 of those individual items. So that's one method for using find and change. And if let me go ahead and close this, and let's find an occurrence of it. And you can see here, here's my Accuride 20-inch. And you can see out of an adjusted unit cost, it's $8.25. And also, didn't show it to you beforehand, but as you can see, all the other Accurides were quarter code. Now it's changed to Hayfla. So using find and change, once you get used to how it's laid out and how it works, I found it a little easier than the old method, simply because the old method you had to go to find, mass select stuff, and then go back to the edit menu and then change it. Now it's all in the same dialog box, so it's a little bit simpler. Let's go back to find again for a second, because I want to show you a couple other things in here that I didn't with that example. And one of them would be, let's say we'll use line type as the same. And let's say for whatever reason, we're going to find the line type of material, and we want a new search. I left the group results on, so it found everything in the estimate that is of the line type material. So here it is. Maybe we have a reason, because I know that this has happened to me in the past when I worked with a few companies. If I didn't have taxes set up correctly maybe the first time, as far as line types, when I did an estimate, maybe my taxes seemed goofy, and I had a reason to select all the material and tell it to put a tax on it or not. So if I want to select all of the line types of the type material, but now on top of it, I also want to add another selection to it, I can change this little drop down to merge results. And now I'm going to change the line type to hardware. And I'm going to click my little binocular button. And now, in my list here, now, as you can see, my number of items found went up. But now everything that's listed in here is a material, and it's also a hardware. So I've merged the results together. And if I had a reason to add another type of line type, like maybe accessory, I can add this in here, click Merge, and then maybe I want to add item to, and click Merge. And so now the list of items that I have includes all 4 of those line types that I just selected because I merged them all together. It's the same as if you ever used Find in version 6.0 or earlier. Inside the Find dialog box from the little drop down, you could have selected material and then had it select all of them. And then we could also change it again to hardware and have it select all and aggregated its selection. It's the same thing that we're doing here. Once I have everything in this list, I can simply click Select All, or the other thing you can do is be selective. Only select a certain amount, hold your Control key down, and you can select more, and then just click Select, and that's all it's going to select. Or, like I said, I can click Select All, and in this case, it's going to select all 10,642 items. And now from here, I can simply go to the Change tab and change it to my heart's content. So, like I say, maybe I wanted to go into sales tax and make it checked or unchecked for some reason. I could easily go in there and do that so that I could, like I say, aggregate my selection. I'm going to click Remove All, and I'm going to change this back to New Search and show you the other method where it says Narrow Results. Let's say I wanted to select, what am I going to do here? Let's say I wanted to make a selection by cost type, and I'm going to choose fabrication because that's the biggest one in there. And I'm going to click New. So now it's going to select every line in the estimate that was of the cost type fabrication. As you can see, it selected almost 15,000 things, simply because it's a lot of them. But now if I had a reason to narrow the results, so maybe within the cost type of fabrication, I wanted to narrow the result, my search down to maybe just the material items that are within that cost type. So I could change the line type to material, click Search, and now it's narrowed the results for me based upon my 2 selection. So now I've narrowed things down. So now the only thing that lists in here, the 8,000 items, is 1, it has to have had a cost type of fabrication, and then 2, a line type of material. So now I've narrowed my selection. So that's how you can use those 3 different ways to find something and then be able to change it. So you can use Find and Change, or you could just use a Find function and then use a Replace after it if you needed to, similar probably to what you used to do in 6.0. For instance, this job happens to be a lead job, and let's say we were going through maybe we ran our line type analysis report. And, oops, let me select a bigger scope. I'm going to select the entire job here. And maybe we ran our line type analysis report. And I was looking through the list of materials, and I noticed, because I was looking through this earlier, maybe I was going through here and I noticed that, oh, I still have some 3/4 inch 4x8 regular particle board that's not NOF or FSC. I need to change that. Depending on how your job specs are set up, in this case, mine were set up such that I didn't cover every area where I could swap it out. So I want to use my Replace function to swap out that last bit of 4x8 regular for the NOF and the FSC. And obviously in this big of a quote, I don't want to have to go line by line and try and figure out where it's at. So I can use my Find function. And I'm going to go through here and use the same thing, line type as material, because I know that's what line type that is. And I'm going to change this to New Search and click. And now it's going to find everything. And this is by default. It's by description. The parent is just showing you what it's inside of, whether it's a subassembly or an assembly or whatever it may be. But everything is in order alphabetized by the description column. So I'm just going to go down to the P's. And sure enough, here's my particle board, 3/4 4x8. If I click on it, it tells me there's 4 instances of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse this down a little bit. And so now I can easily, since I use this find dialog box, I found it in here. So I can go to my estimate, double-click the item, and it brings up that Edit Replace dialog box, and I'm going to choose Replace. Now I'm going to go to where I usually store my lead items and find my 4x8 NOF FSC. Click OK, and just like before, now for the scope, I'm going to come over here to my tree and select the entire job and click Continue, and just leave it on all occurrences because I want to. And so now you can see it found all 4 occurrences, and so now I could swap it out. So that's another way to use finds. You don't always have to use the change. You can simply use the find to find something. And as you can see now, if I went back to my find dialog box and clicked a new search, if I go down to where particle board was at, I don't see that lone item anymore. So that's another way to use the find dialog box. I think for the most part, that's showing you a lot of the different functionalities. Obviously, as you can see in here, we've made this fairly flexible. So there's a lot of different ways to find and change something depending upon what you're trying to do. One last note before I open up the question and answer session 2 is that this session is being recorded. So by tomorrow, it'll be on our website so you can watch it again. But if you'd rather just look through the manual, if you go up to the Help menu and go to the User Guide, it opens up our PDF, and it's in Chapter 8 on the Estimate tab. Or if you just want to type in the page in the PDF, if you don't want to find the bookmark to it, it's on page 217. There's a whole little section on this Find and Change dialog box that steps you through it very similar to what I did. So if you're more of the type that you want to read through it to remind yourself, it's there for your reading. And having said that, the rest of the session I'll just open up for questions and answers. So does anybody have any questions? Anybody have any questions on what I just showed you?
Dave, we're all just in awe, I believe.
Well, good. I'm sure. I know the Find Change dialog box, I mean, especially for those of us that are used to the old way, it took me a couple times to get used to it. But like I say, once I did, I found it a lot more flexible and easier to use than the old methods. But it'll take a few times. You know, I've used it quite a few times, so it probably made it look easy. But once you use it a few times, I think you'll get the hang of it and find that it's a lot more flexible and easier to find and change things.
I really appreciate the part where we can change it on a node, like a room or two, and change those by node.
Definitely, yeah. Whether it's find and change or just even replace, yeah, I know I've played around with it quite a bit. I was just thinking that, man, wish when I used it had that functionality, because you used to have to, especially with replace, sometimes you almost kind of had to trick it by using whichever column you had for a find and replace to put generic values in it so it only hit certain rows. But now we've made that quite a bit easier to be able to fine-tune your selection a lot easier.
Hey, does your job spec still change the same way it always did?
Yeah, job spec doesn't change at all. It still functions the same. The one difference with the job spec is that rather than using the grid to right-click and apply job specs, if you're doing it after the fact, you simply use the tree. So if I close this, if you had, if you had a job spec that you only wanted to apply to this room, you simply right-click the room and apply job specs. Or if you wanted it for the, it depends on which node you want to apply it to, or, for that matter, you can actually pick and choose, just like you could with replace, as to what you want to apply job specs to. But as far as the functionality of job spec, it still works exactly the same. The replace feature existed long before JobSpec ever did. So, and like I say, sometimes there's a few things that sometimes lend their hand easier and better to use in the replace rather than JobSpec. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Is there any other questions? All right. If there aren't any further questions, I appreciate you joining the Lunch and Learn sessions. Hope you got some valuable information out of it. If afterwards you have any questions or want to remember something, remember these are being recorded and put on our website. But if you do have a question, feel free to call support, and we will answer it best we can. Thank you very much for joining the session today. You guys have a great Memorial Day weekend.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks.
You're welcome.
It was a great one.
Thank you.